On Thursday night, Israel launched a sprawling offensive against Iran, with hundreds of tactical aircraft involved in a long list of strikes that reportedly eliminated as many as 20 senior Iranian military officials, while causing significant damage to facilities tied to Iran's nuclear weapons programs. Now, this large-scale operation involved covert Israeli operatives on the ground, carrying out attacks on Iranian air defenses, Ukraine-style drone attacks from hidden locations inside Iran, and, based on images released by the Israeli Defense Force overnight, a fair bit of American-sourced military hardware. But notably, the United States has been clear that it was not directly involved with these strikes. In fact, the response from Western-aligned nations around the world has been pretty consistent so far, with some acknowledging Israel's reasons for the operation, but few offering direct support. And that leaves us with a very important question. Why now? What prompted Israel to carry out these strikes just days before the next scheduled denuclearization talks between Iranian and American leaders? Were these negotiations nothing more than geopolitical theater? And most important of all, what's going to happen next? Let's see if we can't figure it out. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Ukraine's successful drone strikes against 4 air bases deep inside Russia a few weeks ago has provided the Western world with a valuable case study into how drones are changing warfare. And I should know, I actually appeared on Ukrainian national television last week to discuss it. And now, several NATO leaders have begun discussing the lessons they've derived from this unprecedented strike. And I've been staying on top of all that thanks to Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by news outlets all over the world, and then places them into a single easy-to-read feed that helps me not just stay on top of what's going on, but to see right through many of the most common forms of media bias. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 71 news outlets have already covered this story, including 9 left-leaning ones and 16 right-leaning ones. And for a change, left and right-leaning outlets are actually presenting the story in pretty much the same way in their headlines, with left-leaning outlets running ones like "NATO learns as Ukraine's creativity changes battlefield," and right-leaning outlets following suit with headlines like "Ukraine's spiderweb attack was a game-changer. NATO's top admiral explains why." And Ground News also shows you vital information about these outlets along with those headlines, like their political bias, factuality rating, corporate ownership, or government affiliations. And I love the Ground News blind spot feature that shows me stories that are getting lots of coverage in one political sphere, but not in the other. It helps me make sure that I'm keeping my media intake well balanced. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or follow the link in the description below to get a whopping 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan. That'll help you stay on top of things. Now, I had a great episode of Air Power coming your way today about a recent Wall Street Journal report that alleges the U.S. military was testing a secret EMP weapon against its own nuclear missile silos all the way back in the 1960s, and that weapon was so advanced it even fooled witnesses into thinking that it was an alien spacecraft. But then Israel launched this attack on Iran, and I decided to pivot to covering this at the very last minute, so bear with me today. Our discussion will be partially scripted and partially on the fly, and I'm sure my editing after will be pretty hurried too. Now, for years, Western analysts and military leaders have warned of just how dangerous a nuclear-armed Iran would be, and for years, a combination of stop-and-go negotiation efforts and covert sabotage operations has seemingly prevented that from happening. But last night, Israel kicked off what they're calling Operation Rising Lion, a large-scale offensive against senior Iranian leaders, nuclear scientists, ballistic missile production facilities, and Iran's integrated air defense apparatus, among others. Now, this points toward one of two possibilities. Either Iran is very literally on the verge of becoming a full-fledged nuclear power, making Israel's attack really about survival, or Israel is using Iran's nuclear ambitions as justification to strike Iran while its proxy forces throughout the region have been weakened by months of combat operations, and of course, the fall of Assad's friendly regime in nearby Syria. But before we dive into the details, I want to remind you that our discussion today is going to be centered on what's happening and its potential implications. I will not be making political, ethical, or moral judgments about these operations or parties involved, because that's not what I do. Instead, I'm going to try to equip you the best I can to make those kinds of decisions on your own. Now, these strikes were not a spur-of-the-moment thing. It's immediately become clear that Israel has been planning this attack for some time, with Mossad commandos already positioned throughout Iran with smuggled kamikaze drones and other weapon systems. At the onset of this attack, those commandos sprang into action, engaging Iranian radar arrays and missile launchers to both clear a path for forthcoming waves of strike fighters and to limit Iran's ability to strike back at Israel with ballistic missiles. Now, with Iran's air defense apparatus softened, a reported 200 Israeli fighters, seemingly F-35s, F-15s, and two-seat F-16Ds, commenced strikes across Iran, engaging a reported 100 targets with 330 separate munitions, and more on those targets to come. Images released by the IDF and then reported on by the War Zone and several others show fighters armed with GBU-39 small-diameter bombs, radar-guided AIM-120B AMRAAM air-to-air missiles, traditional GPS-guided JDAMs, Python infrared-guided short-range air-to-air missiles, and the AN/ASW-55 data link pod that's used for man-in-the-loop control of the Israeli Popeye air-to-surface missile. Now, this loadout all but guarantees that many of these fourth-generation non-stealth aircraft were conducting these strikes from deep inside Iranian airspace, with seemingly little to no interference from Iranian air defenses or even tactical aircraft like Iran's F-4 Phantoms, MiG-29s, or even their handful of remaining F-14 Tomcats. Now, near as I can tell, the furthest reaching air-to-ground munition we've seen evidence of in these strikes so far has been that aforementioned AGM-142 Popeye missile, which comes in a few different forms with different capabilities. The original and larger Popeye 1 offers a reported range of around 50 miles and can be carried by Israeli F-15s and, in some specific cases, maybe F-16s as well, while the smaller, lighter Popeye 2s can definitely be carried by F-16s and, depending on your source, may even offer a modest range increase. And then there is also the air-breathing Popeye turbo air-launched cruise missile, which would have to be carried by Israeli F-15s if it was used, and that offers the greatest reach of all with a reported 200 miles or so. Now, regardless of which Popeye iteration, these weapons all use inertial or GPS guidance to fly into the general area of their targets, and then they transition over to using an onboard data link for TV guidance via an infrared imaging seeker. In other words, a person actually guides these weapons directly into their target like a kamikaze drone, making them incredibly accurate. Now, the GBU-39 small-diameter bomb is also a very capable weapon, but quite a bit smaller at the 250-pound class. Now, this is a glide bomb that comes with a variety of potential warheads, including traditional blast fragmentation warheads and penetration warheads that are rated to cut through upwards of 3 feet of steel-reinforced concrete prior to detonating. Now, because of their small size, you can actually mount 4 of these bombs on a single BRU-61 bomb rack and then mount that on a fighter like the F-16 in the place of a single 2,000-pound bomb. Now, Israeli F-16s were photographed carrying 2 of these bomb racks each for a total of 8 small-diameter bombs per fighter. But despite the capability and capacity that these GBU-39s really do offer, these weapons are still bombs, and even with their glide wings extended, they remain pretty short-ranged compared to standoff weapons. The US Air Force, which is notorious for underreporting the maximum capabilities for its weapons, says the GBU-39 offers an unclassified range of, quote, over 46 miles. But documents released by the weapons manufacturer, Boeing, indicate a range that's probably better than 60 nautical miles, or around 60 regular miles for the non-pirates in the audience. Quite a bit more than the Air Force is willing to admit. But of course, the actual range of these weapons will vary dramatically depending on the speed and the altitude of the aircraft that's dropping them, and it's uncommon to perform strikes at the outermost limits of a weapon's engagement range. That just isn't a very effective use of your weapons. So these strikes probably took place at closer ranges than you see depicted here. Now, other air-to-ground weapons apparently employed include JDAMs, or Joint Direct Attack munitions, of undisclosed sizes. Now, these are little more than traditional dumb bombs, equipped with modern guidance and fin kits to turn them into precision-guided munitions that can strike stationary targets, even in visually obscured environments. But they also offer a lot less range, only around 15 miles or so. Now, it's totally possible that Israeli F-35s could penetrate deep into Iran to conduct these sorts of strikes, but the fact that non-stealth fourth-generation fighters like F-15s and F-16s, carrying notably short-range air-to-ground weapons, all suggests that Israel was able to very quickly establish air superiority over Iran. Though, because of the distance between Israel and Iran and Israel's lack of sufficient airborne refueling tankers, maintaining that air dominance in the days ahead may not be a foregone conclusion, if only because of Israel's struggle to field sufficient combat sorties over such long ranges to keep that pressure on. Of course, if the US decides to provide support in the form of aerial refueling tankers, well, that could change that calculus. But as of this afternoon, Israel is continuing to conduct daylight strikes on Iranian targets, seemingly without American support, and suggesting that they are still operating with little resistance inside Iranian airspace. Now, these fighters struck targets across at least 6 Iranian military installations and residential homes of senior leaders that are located inside highly secured military complexes, and even a few residential buildings inside Tehran, or Iran's capital. Among these targets were some of Iran's most important nuclear facilities. Most notable among them may be the uranium enrichment facility in Natanz. Now, Israeli officials have claimed to significantly degrade Iran's nuclear weapons development capabilities in these strikes, but it is worth noting that Iran's most secretive and heavily protected facility, known as Fordo, does not appear to be among those targets, and probably for good reason. Fordo's facilities are located deep inside a mountain, estimated to be nearly a half-mile below the surface, and really, the only weapon on the planet that could realistically strike such a target is the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP as it's often called, which is only in service for the US Air Force and can only be deployed from American B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. But the United States has at least thus far been clear that it will not be participating in these strikes. And as notable as Israel's strikes on these nuclear facilities definitely is, the bigger story may even be the targeted assassinations of several senior Iranian military leaders and nuclear scientists. Now, reports are still coming in, but there's reasonable confirmation at this point that among those killed in last night's strikes were Major General Mohammad Bagheri, Iran's top uniformed military officer, Major General Hussein Salami, the head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Gholami Rashid, the deputy commander-in-chief for Iran's armed forces, Amir Ali Hajizadeh, the commander of the IRGC's Air Force, Ali Shamkhani, a former Navy commander who was in charge of nuclear negotiations with the United States, and several notable nuclear scientists, including Fareedan Abbasi and Mohammad Mehdi Taranji. And thanks for bearing with my pronunciation as I got through those. Now, it is important to keep in mind that this list is probably not complete, and that Israeli strikes are ongoing as I put this video together. But even as is, it is clear to see that Israel's strikes were not limited to degrading Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons, but also to significantly hamper Iran's ability to mount an effective response. And this is important because Iran is among the most potent regional powers in the Middle East. I'm going to quote Ashvan Ostavar, an associate professor of national security studies at the Naval Postgraduate School and an expert on Iran's military, about why such a direct attack on Iran hasn't happened before. Quote, "There is a reason Iran has not been struck. It's not that Iran's adversaries fear Iran, it's that they realize that any war against Iran is a very serious war." And he's not wrong. With among the largest standing military forces and the largest stockpiles of ballistic missiles and one-way attack drones anywhere in the Middle East, Iran is a serious regional player that's bolstered by both direct and indirect support from a long list of proxy forces trained and equipped by Iran's secretive Quds Force. Now, despite Israel's more advanced military technology, much of which is sourced from the United States, Iran could be considered a stronger military power in some regards. And in fact, the popular website globalfirepower.com even does rank Iran's military as just above Israel's, at least in terms of overall combat capacity. But with these successful decapitation strikes coinciding with what, at least for now, seems to be a complete collapse of Iran's integrated air defense apparatus, Israel may have successfully created enough confusion and panic within the Iranian command structure to limit or at least delay any really sizable response, at least for now. Overnight, for instance, it was reported that Iran did launch at least 100 one-way attack drones, likely the Shahed 136 or similar systems, at Israeli targets, but initial reports seem to indicate that all of them, or at least most of them, were intercepted. There have also been reports of ballistic missile launches from Iran and Iranian proxies like the Houthis in Yemen, which, at least so far, reports seem to indicate were largely intercepted. Now, the confusion created within Iran's military by these strikes is all but certainly exacerbated by Iran's highly centralized command structure, meaning the nation's defense apparatus is accustomed to decisions being made at the highest possible levels and then merely enacted through delegation. Now, this model is a direct contrast to the American and common Western approach to command, for instance, which emphasizes a strong NCO or non-commissioned officer corps and empowering decision-making at the tactical level. In the short term, Iran's loss of senior leaders will severely impact its operational capabilities, but Iran is certain to be working to quickly refill these gapped positions, and once they do, Iran is certain to mount a counteroffensive that's more robust and less piecemeal than what we've seen so far. So, now that we more or less know what's going on, let's talk about what the broader implications of this attack might be. First and foremost, it's unclear just how effective these strikes could really be at hindering Iran's nuclear weapons development because, again, Israel lacks the means to strike the nation's most protected sites without direct American assistance. And despite Israel's immediate successes in these operations, it is still entirely possible that Iran will mount a significant response. In that event, it's honestly tough to see how Israel could win such a fight, at least in the long run, without direct U.S. intervention. The United States is, of course, hoping not to find itself dragged into another war in the Middle East, as exemplified by statements from Secretary of State Marco Rubio immediately following the onset of this offensive. I'll quote him now. "Tonight, Israel took unilateral action against Iran. We are not involved in strikes against Iran, and our top priority is protecting American forces in the region. Israel advised us that they believe this action was necessary for its self-defense. President Trump and the administration have taken all necessary steps to protect our forces and remain in close contact with our regional partners. Let me be clear, Iran should not target U.S. interests or personnel." Now, there have been contradicting reports on just how aware the U.S. was of this Israeli plan, with at least some evidence pointing toward the US military maybe being aware that an attack was brewing, but not necessarily exactly when it would play out. But conversely, this morning, President Trump seemed to indicate that these attacks actually occurred on a timeline that he set. And I'll quote him now. Iran should have listened to me when I said, I gave them, I don't know if you know, but I gave them a 60-day warning, and today is day 61. Now, the president seemed to believe these strikes would force Iran back to the negotiating table regarding its nuclear ambitions. But some have questioned whether or not the American president was as privy to this Israeli strike plan as it seems. After all, the U.S. was slated to conduct nuclear negotiations with Iran in just 2 days. And now, the Iranian official who would participate in those talks has been killed by an Israeli strike. But regardless of the level of U.S. support Israel had going into this fight, it does still seem at least possible that Israel will need Uncle Sam's help to get back out of it. And this much was seemingly confirmed, at least in the past, starting in 2008, when U.S. President George W. Bush reportedly convinced Israel not to directly strike Iran's nuclear weapons facilities because, you guessed it, he didn't want the U.S. to be dragged into a war with Iran right behind them. Then, in 2012, it happened again, when it was reported that the Obama administration entered into direct nuclear negotiations with Iran again, as part of an effort to prevent Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu from launching strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, and again, kicking off a large-scale conflict in the region that would ultimately probably force U.S. involvement. And anecdotally, I've personally spoken to personnel who formerly worked at U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM as it's often called, the American command that oversees Middle East operations, and they told me that one of the most difficult parts of being a CENTCOM leader is continuously trying to keep Israel from dragging the United States into a war with Iran. But, and this is a really important but, it is also worth noting that the threat environment has changed quite a bit since then, and Israeli operations have been in high gear since Hamas launched a terror attack against Israel on October 7th of 2023. Now, since then, Israel has severely compromised the combat capacity of Iranian proxies, like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. And of course, last night's strikes point to Israeli intelligence operations piercing very deep into Iran's defense apparatus, making those attacks so much more effective than they otherwise could have been. And that could all collectively indicate that Israel is somewhat confident that they may well be able to handle this fight on their own. But on the other hand, it's also important to note that public perceptions inside Israel have also dramatically shifted since that October 7th attack. And current polls show that most Israeli citizens now favor military action against Iran, whom they perceive as the mastermind behind that terror attack. And as Daniel Byman pointed out for the Center for Strategic and International Studies this morning, public buy-in within the Israeli population has all but certainly increased Israel's tolerance for risk. But public support and even strategic opportunity are absolutely not the same as a pressing existential threat, and Israel has, at least so far, been adamant that this attack was prompted solely by the fact that Iran's nuclear weapons program has recently crossed the threshold into true combat viability. Or, in other words, Iran, according to Israel, was or is right on the cusp of actually producing a nuclear weapon, or actually a number of them. According to a report from the War Zone, Israeli intelligence claims Iran now has the capability to produce 15 nuclear warheads and the missile delivery systems necessary to ferry those warheads to Israel. Now, this marks, as Israeli intelligence put it, the point of no return that necessitated immediate military action. Of course, we don't know if that's true, but I do want to be clear that, objectively speaking, it is entirely possible. Iran has been slowly working toward fielding nuclear weapons for literally years now, and to some extent, them actually doing it has been an inevitability for some time. Now, whether or not these strikes could eliminate that threat, or even if it is real, could still just spiral into an even larger threat is, at least for now, still entirely unclear. Now, despite President Trump's public approval of Israel's attack, there has been no indication that American forces are preparing for anything other than defending against potential Iranian attacks should they target American installations in the Middle East. And therein may lie the most significant threat of America being pulled into this fight. If Iran's response is not limited to Israeli targets and instead includes American forces in the region, as they openly threatened they would do, things will get a lot messier fast. If attacks on American forces are limited and blunted by American air defenses, de-escalation from the American side could still be possible. But if the U.S. suffers any kind of appreciable losses, especially of personnel, in Iran's retaliatory strikes, well, then the chances of American involvement increase significantly. But while that's not what America wants, it's also worth remembering that there's a good chance that isn't what Iran wants either. After all, Iran has a much better chance of fighting its way to a negotiated settlement, maybe even on some of their terms, in a conflict that's limited to between Iran and Israel. And while America may not want to find itself fighting another war in the Middle East, certainly one that could be much more difficult and even a lot more bloody than past asymmetric conflicts, for America's massive military apparatus, such a fight would largely be a question of politics, budget allocations, and priorities, while for Iran, it would immediately become a question of survival. But as I finish putting this piece together, a reported 150 Iranian ballistic missiles are currently in the air, with at least 2 already making landfall in Tel Aviv, and another wave of missiles about to follow behind. So the one thing I can say for sure at this stage is that what we've seen over the past 24 hours appears to be just the beginning, and we won't really know how this all shakes out until it ultimately does. So for now, stay safe, stay well informed, and depending on where you are in the world, keep your head down. This fight may just be getting started. And with that ends this special edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and don't forget to leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.